Welcome to A Parent's Guide to Child Development. I'm your host, Anna-Marie Von Furley from Fledglings Flight. Each podcast, we strive to give parents the tools they need to help their child thrive through conversations with experts in child development and psychology, where you can learn about the most important information that you didn't know existed. Today, we're tackling a topic that quietly shapes everything from how your child holds a pencil to how they handle a loud noise at the grocery store. And most parents have never even heard the term. We're talking about primitive reflexes, the involuntary pre-wired movements babies are born with that are supposed to fade away in the first year of life. When they don't, they can show up years later as anxiety, poor handwriting, picky eating, trouble sitting still, or even chronic stomach aches. And almost nobody connects the dots back to infancy. To help us decode this, I'm joined by Emily Roper, a neurodevelopmental delay therapist, certified midwife assistant, and founder of Early Roots. Emily has attended more than 600 births and has spent over a decade helping kids with ADHD, autism, anxiety, dyslexia, and sensory challenges. And she has a rare gift for connecting what happens in pregnancy and birth to what shows up in the classroom years later. She also hosts the Early Roots podcast. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Oh my gosh, you're not as excited as me because this is my super favorite topic in the entire world and I never get to talk about it. And now I get to, so I'm so excited.
Yay.
And everyone's like, why are you two so nerding out on this? Like, we don't even know what it is. All right, so let's not keep them in suspense. What are primitive reflexes and what are their purpose?
Sure. So babies are born with a set of reflexes that do a lot of different things. So basically, when babies are born, they are born super early developmentally. They don't really have a lot of control over their body or their movements or anything that they're doing. So they really rely on these kind of ingrained movement patterns. And these reflexes do all sorts of things. They help with survival. They help with the birth process. They encourage movement. They help to develop things like visual skills, and they help with things like sensory processing. They're basically just a whole complex set of movements that keep babies alive and help them develop and function early on.
Yeah, I often talk about it when I have to talk about it with people is like babies are like just like born with this bag of bones and they don't know how to operate it. And the reflexes are there until they figure out how to operate their body. So it keeps them
Great
alive.
description.
Opening their mouth to receiving the food is the reflex, and breathing, sucking, swallowing, all of those things are reflex because they don't have the ability to choose to do it until they figure it out. So
That's right.
So reflexes can be grouped into categories: feeding, mobility, use of hands, body coordination, and self-preservation. Can you walk us through that framework and why it's useful?
Sure. So we have so many different reflexes. There's actually hundreds of different infant reflexes.
What?
We just rarely look at that many of them. But they're doing a lot of different things. So you have some reflexes that are in place for things like survival, and basically they're there to keep babies alive. Things like our startle reflex, our Moro. It's what jumpstarts breathing after birth, and it's what keeps our like cortisol and adrenaline levels high if we need them. So we have some they're there for survival to keep us alive. We have others that are there to help build different brain and body connections. So our brain develops basically through movement and use. So if we don't use our body, we don't move right, we don't interact with the environment, then our brain doesn't really get to develop optimally. And so a lot of the role of these reflexes is to basically force babies to move their body and interact with their environment in a way that will help them develop all the skills that they need later on to crawl, to stand, to walk, to read and write, and do all of these more advanced skills later. They really kind of have to be forced into using their body in a way that helps those pieces to develop right.
Fantastic. That's amazing. You're so fluent in this topic. What's the difference between a reflex being present and a reflex being integrated, and what's actually happening in the brain when integration occurs?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, this is a really complex topic. I'll try to like break it down so it's
Mhm.
concise and easy to understand. So basically what happens is babies are born with these early reflexes and they need them for a period of time, but then these reflexes should start to disappear. They integrate, is what we say, into much more advanced and dynamic movements. And primitive reflexes are a little bit different than what a lot of people think about as a normal reflex. So, usually, when you mention something like a reflex, people think about putting your hand on a hot stove and then you yank it back. And that is what we would call like a spinal cord reflex, where information travels from your fingertips, it travels through your arm, and as soon as it reaches your spinal cord, you have a response where you engage your muscles and you yank your hand back. And technically, that is going to happen before it reaches the brain and we're consciously aware of it. All of it happens so quickly that we really can't tell a difference, but it's happening technically before it reaches the brain. Primitive reflexes are regulated by the brainstem, so not the spinal cord. They're up a little bit higher and they're a little bit less black and white. So they're a little bit more complex in the way that they work. They don't always look exactly the same every time, but they're still pretty basic and rudimentary. But then as we age, we should have even more complex reflexes that develop where our brain is processing a lot of different information, it's utilizing different parts, and then we're having more complex responses. So we kind of have these different phases of what reflexes look like. And for primitive reflexes, they should be active while babies are young and don't have a lot of conscious control over their body, and while their brains are pretty immature and underdeveloped. But as the rest of the brain develops and takes over, it should kind of suppress these reflexes. So rather than these reflexes being really active and intense, we have much more mature responses to the environment. So the easiest example is to look at our startle reflex. So newborn babies have a really sensitive startle reflex. So it's really easy to trigger. You bump them, you make a noise, and they have kind of this big response. But as they age, what should happen is we should have developed connections to other parts of our brain that include things like orienting to look and see what's going on, to make these really quick snap judgments as to what is happening. And then our body has kind of a variety of different ways that it will respond. And so you see basically go from more simple, basic responses to more complex, dynamic responses as the brain ages. But there's a lot of things that can disrupt that process, where babies or kids kind of get stuck and they hold on to this kind of more intense, immature response, and they don't develop this more dynamic response. So, what it should look like as kids get older is that these reflexes either really disappear completely or they're just not very active. You see like very mild responses to them only in very intense or specific situations. For the most part, what you should see take over are these more complex, complicated responses to things. And that obviously looks a little bit different from child to child and depending on what reflexes you're looking at. So I hope that that answers your question.
Yes, that's great. And you actually might have covered most of the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case there's anything more
Sure.
you want to add. So, going back to the Moro reflex, which is tied
Hmm.
to self-preservation, it's what triggers a baby's first breath at birth. So, can
Hmm.
you walk us through that and why it's such a remarkable design?
Sure. So this is actually the reflex that I probably spend the most time working on. It's the most common one that I see retained in the kids that I work with. And it's a very cool reflex because it helps babies go from being a fetus to being a newborn, basically. And that's a really complicated transition. So when babies are in the womb, mom is really doing a lot of the work for them. So they're providing oxygen and food and a lot of different physiological things. And then as soon as babies are born, they have to take over those functions on their own. They have to start breathing on their own. They have to start digesting food. They have to start really actively engaging with the environment. And it's kind of a period of time that we overlook a lot because most of the time babies do that on their own really easily. So we don't think of it as being this really complicated, intense experience, but it is one of the most complex physiological transitions that we ever do as a species. And one of the things that babies need for that is to have a lot higher levels of cortisol. And cortisol is our stress hormone. And so usually when we think about cortisol, we think of it in a negative light. We think of like having too much stress, but for babies, when they're in the womb, they have very low cortisol levels, and then they're born, and we need those actually to raise in order for them to be able to interact with their environment properly, to breathe right, to kind of mediate and regulate a lot of the physiological changes that they have to. And that startle reflex is one of the key things that makes that happen. So they're born, they're exposed to gravity, all of a sudden there's lights and noises, and they're very sensitive to that. And they startle and they take a deep breath, and it creates this massive cascade of physiological changes that are happening. And then they keep that for several months afterwards, actually. And that helps them to continue to make a lot of changes. It helps to really encourage what we would call attachment behaviors in their caregivers. So it keeps their caregivers like very attuned to them. It helps them to develop good connections and all of these pieces that we need later on. Did that fully answer the question? I can't remember if it was the whole thing or not.
Yeah,
But
no, it's amazing. Yes, and that's so much more than I expected. So thank you.
sure. Yes, it's one of my favorite topics. I'm so passionate
Oh,
about this.
oh man. Oh, I've got stories about the Moro reflex. We may not
Mm,
get into them here depending on time, but we're definitely in the IG Live. I've got stories. So, a retained Moro reflex has been linked to everything from anxiety and allergies to difficulty with criticism and dislike of clothing tags. How does one reflex affect so many seemingly unrelated systems?
sure. Um, so I think it's important to not just think of this as like a little reflex. This is what mediates the foundation of our entire response to stress and threat, and how we regulate stress and how safe and stable we feel in the world. So it provides the foundation on which so many other things are built. So when kids keep this kind of hypersensitive, hyperactive stress response, what you see is all sorts of negative problems and kind of this negative domino effect with the way lots of other parts of the brain and body develop. And so basically, the easiest way to think about this is that when kids keep this early reflex, they don't develop a mature response to stress in the environment. They are essentially living in a fight or flight state, is kind of the best way to describe it. So they are more sensitive to their environment. They physiologically overreact to that. And when you live in that kind of like chronic heightened stress state, it's going to really negatively impact things like emotional development, things like connection and regulation, and how we relate to other people. It's going to really affect things like attention and arousal. So it's one of the most common things that I see in older kids that struggle with a lot of attention things. They kind of tend to hyperfixate on some things, or they're really distractible. All of like our ability to regulate our focus and attention is kind of based on how we respond to stress and threat in the environment. And then also on the other kind of side of that, it affects physical development and physical health too. When you live in these like chronic states of stress, it can tank things like immune function and digestive health. So it's really connected to things like asthma and allergies and that whole kind of immune spectrum of things, because our body is not meant to exist in this type of state for long periods of time. We are meant to experience some stressful things and then recover, and experience some stress and recover. And when you kind of have like just baseline elevated stress levels, it really tanks a lot of things.
Yeah, that was really wonderful. Thank you for that. So the Moro reflex is replaces the fear paralysis reflex. When that handoff doesn't happen cleanly, what does it look like emotionally? And why do you see it tied to anxiety, mood swings, and sensory overwhelm later?
Sure. So the fear paralysis is a really interesting reflex. This is actually one that is kind of more on the theoretical spectrum, because this is a reflex that we think is present during the embryonic stage of development. So that's really early in pregnancy. And basically, what they observe is that you'll see these little embryos, if they're stimulated, will have like a full body withdrawal and freeze, which is similar to other kind of stress responses that we see in startle reflexes that we see in other animals, kind of like fainting goats is probably the closest one, although that's not quite the same thing. But basically, we have it's like this really intense stress and really immature stress response. It is one that would be mediated by the spinal cord. So, kind of like when you touch a hot stove and withdraw, that's that same type of response. But this is a reflex that should basically turn into the Moro pretty early in pregnancy. So it's not something that we typically see in babies after they're born. But it's one of the things that when you have anything that kind of disrupts development in pregnancy early on, any like major stressors, major threats, then the like we theorize that it's possible that babies kind of hold on to that really intense form of their startle reflex as like a survival mechanism, basically, that they don't develop a more dynamic Moro reflex and they get stuck in this like super heightened freeze response. This is one of those things that's really hard to test and hard to study. Anytime you're talking about like reflexes that only happen in pregnancy and embryonic development, they're just tricky things to like really get a clear picture on. But that being said, I have worked with kids that I suspected had a fear paralysis reflex or something really similar to that, where they would have these whole body freeze responses, just really, really intense responses to threat and stress. It's, kind of just like this hyperactive stress response. So those tend to be more rare. Most of the time, what I'm dealing with are kids that fall into that Moro category, but certainly that can happen for kids that experience a lot of complications prenatally too.
Could that also be like one of the things I was thinking about is like another animal that has fear paralysis? Oh, like all animals have them, right? But is the deer in the headlights, right? And people are always
Hmm.
like, why does the deer just stay there where the car is coming at them? It's because
Hmm.
they're frozen because of this reflex. But I'm wondering, while you were talking, it made me think about people who, under high states of stress, can't talk. Like
Hmm.
their ability to speak just they sort of freeze.
Hmm.
Would that be related to the fear paralysis or no?
Uh, so it's hard to say. Like we have an adaptive freeze response. And so
Okay.
you can have people that freeze in response to threat. And that's just like, oh, what they have that's well developed. And that
Yeah.
could be like, to me, those are red flags that is a really intense and kind of low level. What I mean by low level is that is like a kind of immature response. It is like very basic, very much like we are really threatened. And it's kind of like evolutionarily a very kind of early response to threat. So it doesn't mean that that's not something that we all might utilize at different times if we need it. But what it shouldn't be is our primary or only response. So when I
Mhm.
see kids that I suspect have a fear paralysis, that's basically how they interact with the world. And they are responding like that to situations and things that really shouldn't create a stress response at all. So these are like really sensitive, really hyperactive ones. So if I'm talking to an adult or somebody that has some social anxiety and they tend to freeze or clam up, I don't necessarily think, oh, that's a fear paralysis, but it definitely is like, they have a very sensitive stress response. Like they have a very um, intense reaction to this that may or may not be appropriate for the situation. So it's not necessarily a reflex, but it's kind of in the spectrum of the way our stress response develops.
Interesting. So now we're going to move on to my favorite collection of reflexes, which are the ones that affect coordination. So asymmetric tonic neck, symmetric tonic neck, spinal galant, and tonic labyrinthine. At a high level, what role do these play in helping a baby learn to move their body intentionally?
Yeah, so babies go through several different stages of motor development. So when they're first born, they tend to make like more often whole body movements where they're kind of using their arms and legs at the same time. They don't really have good differentiation between their left and right sides or the top and like the upper and lower halves of their body. All of the pieces are just kind of immaturely connected. And we have different reflexes that help us to begin to coordinate our whole body. So, a big part of what's happening during infancy and during like a big part of brain development during this stage is basically our brain learning how to connect to and control our body. So, most of early development is learning motor skills, learning how to move, how to sit, how to crawl, how to stand, how to walk. All of those skills are basically our brain is figuring out how to connect to our body and how to coordinate our arms and legs and get everything to work together. So babies go through these stages where they kind of do mostly whole body movements, and then they break up their left and right side, and then they break up their upper and lower halves. And what you should wind up with is an older child that has kind of good control over all four quadrants of their body. So they can use one arm without it spilling over to the other arm. They can coordinate their opposite arm and leg. They can do kind of more complex movements. And these reflexes are really kind of building all of those different connections. They each do different things that help with basically getting control of the body and doing other things and developing other systems that also help with that too. So for example, pretty much all of these reflexes are also helping to develop visual skills. So where kids are learning how to track. So can their eyes move smoothly side to side? Can they follow something that's moving? Can they follow a line of print? They're learning to do things like converge, where both eyes are able to work together as a team so that our brain is getting one clear image and can make sense of the information that's coming in from our eyes. It's helping to really stimulate and mature our vestibular system, which is a little piece in your ear that helps you know where you are in space and what your body is doing. And it helps with all sorts of processing, like sensory processing and perception. So it helps us know what is going on inside our body and what is going on in the environment around us. And all of these reflexes just play a role in helping to build all of those connections and get the brain and body to work together as a team. And that's really important because that our brain and our body working together as a team is what provides the foundation for lots of other brain function down the road. So things like emotion regulation, like social awareness, like learning, reading, writing, attention, academics, all of those pieces have their roots in these early brain and body connections. So if our eyes aren't working right, then it's going to be really hard to read. If our stress response is not on board correctly, it's going to be really hard to focus our attention. Like there's just a lot of these later, more advanced skills that really need us to have these foundational pieces solid first.
Yes. Oh, God, that was so good. All right. The spinal galant is the one most parents have never heard of. What is it, and why do you sometimes hear it called the ants in your pants reflex when it's retained?
Sure. So we have this little, their babies have this little reflex where when you stroke down either side of their spine on their lower back, you'll see the hip and shoulder on that side kind of curved together like they're squirming.
Yeah.
And we're not fully sure why this reflex is there. We think that it helps with the birth process. We
Yeah.
think that it helps encourage movement and keep like get help babies with good hip mobility and help to encourage just a lot of different movement things. But when kids keep this reflex as they get older, it can make them really sensitive when that part of their back is stimulated. And so if they have like a pair of pants or a chair or something that's rubbing on that part of the back, then it's going to cause some movement and wiggliness in the hips. And so that's kind of why we call it the ants in the pants one, is that we have kids that anytime you touch that part of their back, they're just constantly wiggling.
And the other thing too that I know about it is if you run, so you do stroke one side, they curl to one side. You stroke the other side of the spine, they curl the other way. But if you run two fingers down either side, they wet their pants. And so it also can be associated with bedwetting because what's happening, it's being stimulated by a sheet or long hair or something that can trigger this bedwetting. And so a lot of times parents are thinking that, oh, they have to stop drinking water after a certain time, or it's a psychological issue, like some kind of stress or anxiety, when it really just could be that this reflex was never integrated. And from what I read, it actually integrates through the vaginal birth, right? It helps the kid shimmy its way out. But if the child was born through a cesarean, oftentimes that reflex doesn't get integrated because it didn't have that opportunity of the muscles in the abdomen to shove the baby out of the birth canal.
Yes. So a couple of things on that. Yes, there is a different reflex where when you stroke down both
Ah,
sides, it causes, and this is something we see in animals mostly. So it causes urination, and I can't remember the name of that. That's not necessarily a reflex we always expect babies to have, but it's one of those ones that's why we suspect there's a connection because we
yeah.
know that kids that bedwet beyond like age 5 or so are more likely to have this reflex retained than those who don't. And we know that for a certain percentage of those, if you take care of this reflex, the bedwetting goes away. It's not always the case. There's a lot of different reasons why kids can bedwet. Sometimes it's related, even like sometimes I see it connected to the Moro reflex and their ability to like perceive their own body sensations and that type of thing. So it can be related to sensory processing stuff too. It can be related to hormones. Some kids will just always wet the bed until they go through puberty, and then all of a sudden, the hormone shift in puberty changes that. So there's bedwetting is a really interesting one. There's kind of a lot of different reasons why that can happen, but certainly if you have a child that's bedwetting, seeing if they have a spinal galant is a good thing to check for because it's more likely to be there if they bedwet. And then as far as the birth goes, there is truth to that for that reflex, but also really for all of them. Actually, complications with the birth process are the number one risk factor that we look at for having retained reflexes. So the process of a normal labor and a vaginal birth help to strengthen all of the different reflexes that we're looking at. And when you have like a cesarean delivery or something like a forceps or vacuum delivery or a lot of birth trauma, even an induction, any of those pieces are anytime you experience those types of things, you're more likely to have a child that has retained reflexes after. Doesn't always like it's not always so black and white.
Right, right.
We're pretty resilient. So usually if you just have one risk factor, you're okay. But when you start to combine them, all of a sudden you see kids that have a lot of issues later on. But birth is important for a lot of different reflexes.
Well, that's good to know. So the asymmetrical and symmetrical tonic neck reflexes are tied to crawling and crossing the midline, which is this imaginary line down the center of your body. Can you explain why crawling matters so much for brain development and what happens when a baby skips it?
Sure. Yeah. So the ATNR reflex is one where when the head turns to either side, whatever side they're facing, that arm and leg extend and the other arm and leg bend. And what it's doing, that reflex in particular, is helping to break up the left and right sides of the body so that kids can do opposing things with their left and right sides. And they can eventually use their left and right sides really independently. Um, while that reflex is still there, it kind of creates this invisible barrier at the midline of the body where it's really hard for them to coordinate the two sides of their body. The STNR, that's the symmetrical tonic neck reflex, is similar, but it affects our upper and lower halves of our body. And it is also one that babies use while they're crawling to help them develop the posture that they need to go from crawling to standing. And crawling is really important because it's really connecting a lot of different parts of our body that we don't get otherwise. So most people look at crawling and think like it's just kind of a means to an end. And if they start walking, then it doesn't matter. But crawling is really, really important because it's helping to develop coordinations between the left and right sides, between the upper and lower halves of the body. It is doing what we call like bilateral stimulation, where we're getting different input on different sides of our body and different sides of our brain. So, one of the big things that we know about crawling is that when kids skip crawling, they're more likely to have problems with the way the left and right sides of their brain communicate, with the way that the left and right side, or with the way that their eyes move side to side, with the way that their eyes converge. And so we're getting a lot of feedback, a lot of input that helps the left and right sides of our brain and body. Babies are also, for the first time, really actively engaging with their environment in a way that they choose. So they're starting to navigate the world themselves rather than being carried or moved places. And they're developing a lot of really important visual skills when they do that. So they go from looking down at the ground and crawling, and then they look up and they focus their visual attention somewhere else in the room. And they're developing this skill of being able to focus their attention on something close by and then refocus on something that's further away. And all of those different eye movements are helping to develop the skills that kids need for reading and writing later. We know that there's a strong connection between crawling and literacy. So kids
Huh?
that skip that crawling stage are more likely to struggle with reading and writing later on, because what we're doing with crawling is developing all of the physical and neurological skills that we need to read later on, and to really hone in the visual skills that we need for reading.
Awesome. So let's talk about feeding. What jobs are the rooting, sucking, and Babkin reflexes doing in those first weeks of life? And when should each one integrate?
Okay. So Um, the the main thing with like sucking and rooting reflexes is obviously that they're helping babies to feed. And so we think, babies are not very good at feeding themselves when they're first born. We really have to like put everything in their mouth and get them at least close. But if you think about it, you can't force somebody to eat. And
Yeah.
babies don't come out knowing how to eat. They've never done it before. And so they require these reflexes in order to actually get food into them, because when they're in the womb, mom just like provides it through the umbilical cord. They just get it streamlined right to them. But once they're born, they have to start actually doing that themselves. And so these reflexes are helping them take in food. It's also helping them to develop jaw movements that they will later use for things like speech. It is helping to develop our palate and our airway so that we can breathe properly and we take in oxygen well. And so, all of these kind of early reflexes are helping to shape our jaw, to get us food, to shape our airways. And all of those things are important for survival. And these early suck and rooting reflexes should integrate within the first 7 months or so. So by the time kids are, and there's, depending on what textbook you look at, you'll see some variation in that. So these early reflexes should start to disappear as we begin to eat food, and as we change the way that we're eating and we start to chew on things and we start to move from milk to food. We should develop kind of more advanced mouth movements.
And the Babkin reflex has to do with getting the food from like the baby feeding themselves with their hands, as far as I understand it. Is that
So
right?
the Babkin response is like I hear a lot of. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the Babkin reflex. The only Babkin one that I'm familiar with is that we have like the part of our brain that controls our mouth and the part of our brain that controls our hands are closely connected, so that we can develop good coordination between our hands and our mouth.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, like, a lot of times you'll see when people are really focused and doing things with their hands, especially if they have some fine motor delays, you'll see their mouth get really involved. Like, our hands and our mouths are supposed to kind of coordinate and work well together. I'm assuming that's what you mean.
Yes, that is
Okay.
exactly what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah. And I
Okay.
think for parents, what it would look like is when your baby's like kneading your boob while they're nursing. And
Hmm.
so that is the Babkin reflex. They're like, give me
Hmm.
all the milk. And it's there to
Hmm.
stimulate the milk production and get more milk. But what I've read is that that is what its intended goal is, that coordination between hand and mouth.
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. So the rooting reflex is supposed to disappear between 4 and 6 months, and the sucking reflex around 2 months. What does it look like when these are still active in a toddler and older child?
Yeah, so the most common like symptom things that I see are problems with like oral sensitivity, problems with speech, problems with airway development. So those are kind of the big, the big things is these reflexes really like should start to disappear pretty early. We should develop really good control of our mouth. And this happens before speech. This happens like long before we're developing these more advanced oral skills. So usually what we're going to see most often is that it affects speech, it affects breathing, it affects eating and kind of oral sensitivity. So you get kids that tend to be pickier eaters, or that are really really messy, or that choke or gag a lot on things, that just like don't have good coordination of their mouth.
Yeah, I was thinking thumb sucking and that kind
Mhm.
of thing as well. Um, yeah,
So
or chewing on pencils.
yep, I do get a lot of that. So there is a strong connection between our suck reflex and our Moro reflex. So what you see is if babies are sucking on something, same thing with our palmar. So there's like a grasping reflex in our hand. If that reflex is active, if they're sucking on something, it diminishes their stress response and they're less likely to startle. So that's what you see like if a baby is nursing at the breast and they tend to be a little less sensitive, a little bit more calm, and we think like, they're content and they feel safe and secure, and that's great. That all of these things are working together to help develop a lot of pieces. So these reflexes, we talk about them individually, but functionally they all operate together in a lot of ways. So if that suck reflex is active, babies are less likely to have that big startle response. They're more likely to have kind of a diminished stress response, which makes sense. You know, it keeps them latched on, keeps them fed, they're safe, they're on mom. Um, but what you see in older kids a lot of times is that they will suck and chew on things and they get kind of that oral fixation almost as a way to reduce their stress. So you see it as like kind of a coping mechanism to stress. You even see it, you can see that in older babies as they get bigger. They have the pacifier, it's calming, it's soothing. Something we just kind of innately know about kids is that they like to suck on things and that helps them feel regulated. So a lot of times when I see older kids that are chewing on stuff that have a lot of oral fixations, to me, I'm thinking more about that being related to their Moro and their stress response. The other thing is that most of the time when you work on the Moro reflex and you get that one to integrate, it spills into the oral reflexes too. So I rarely have to work on just oral reflexes alone. Most of the time, if you work on the stress response, you see it domino into these other areas too.
Amazing. All right, moving on. The stepping and plantar reflexes are the ones parents love showing off. Look, my newborn is walking. What are these reflexes actually preparing the body to do? And as a sidebar, I have a photo of my son with his stepping reflex being being integrated, and I was like, "Look, he's 5 days old and he's already walking."
Yes, those are fun ones. They're so cute. You hold them up and it basically like looks like babies are walking, they're taking steps. The big thing with both of those reflexes is that they're helping to develop connections between the brain and those parts of the body so that we can eventually coordinate more advanced motor skills. So it's kind of like a use it or lose it type thing. We really want to have good connections between our brain and all the parts of our body. And so that's helping to build connections between our legs and our feet. It helps with a lot of coordination skills and just being able to use our legs and our hips effectively.
Amazing. So, what does it mean when these mobility reflexes don't integrate on time, and how might that affect how a child eventually walks, runs, or balances?
So usually with the mobility type reflexes, the biggest thing that I'm seeing is just coordination issues. So they have like really funny gaits or they toe walk a lot, although that can be a combination of different reflexes. They seem kind of clumsy and awkward on their feet. They don't coordinate their lower and upper body well. These are the kids that just like cannot quite get it together on the sports field or whatever it is. They just look kind of
They,
awkward and gangly.
they walk into furniture.
Yes, they're bumping into things all of the time. And it's not just, our mobility reflexes coordinate with our vestibular system and it coordinates with our eyes, and all of these pieces work together. So it's not usually just one thing that's going that didn't quite develop right. It's kind of this whole combination of all of these pieces that help us to develop really good control of our body and really good coordination. So the mobility reflexes are definitely ones that can contribute to that.
Fantastic. All right, moving on to my second favorite type of reflex is the palmar grasp reflex, which is the newborn finger squeeze. Every family's got that photo of the baby holding on to one of the parents' fingers. And I always like to break it to parents like, your child's not choosing to do that. That's a reflex. Um, what is its real developmental job and when should it integrate?
Sure. Yes, it's the cutest one. It always gets the best pictures, and families are always so excited that the baby's holding their hand. This reflex has a couple of jobs. One of the big things is it is also helping to develop a lot of fine motor skills. So it's just bringing a lot of stimulation and connection between our head or between our brain and our hands. And we really, really rely on our hands to do so many things for us as we get older. We utilize our fingers and our hands a lot for all sorts of fine motor skills. So it's kind of laying the foundation for us to develop later fine motor skills. Like I mentioned before, it also is thought to help be kind of part of our survival reflexes, where it helps babies to kind of hold on to moms and or their caregivers, whoever's holding on to them. It also reduces our stress response a little bit. So less likely to startle if we're clinging on to mom. And this reflex should go away within the first few months or so. Again, there's some variation depending on what book you look at. So I don't, if it's 2 to 4 to 5 months, it's not something I tend to worry about too much. Usually by 6 months or so, it's starting to disappear, especially like as babies are interacting more with their environment. That's when you tend to see these reflexes should be gone. Some of them, like the Moro, should disappear within the first 4 months, but it will still be active for 6 to 7 months during sleep. So, there's just some variations with some of those.
Yeah, Mary, you were talking about that. It made me think, like, because I have a toy store, all the kids, like 100% of the time, if you get a kids $5, they're buying a squishy. And I tell parents, they're like, what are you going to do with it? And it's like, well, it's calming for them. And that needing of that is releasing the oxytocin, which is like bringing down their stress levels, which is why you can't buy Nidos anymore because everybody wants them. But I think that's kind of a real world sort of example of why fidgets and like squishies are so sought after by children and actually adults too that have anxiety.
Yeah, that's very true. That's a great example. Some of that has to do definitely with like our connection between stress response and our hands. Things like repetitive movements, things like that sort of sensory input, all of those things are very regulating to the body. So anytime my office is just full of like fidget toys and squishy toys. It's all the kids' favorites. So those things are very regulating for kids and adults too. All the
It's
dads like the fidget section.
all right. So most primitive reflexes should integrate by the time a baby is around a year old. What are the biggest things that can interfere with that timeline with birth interventions, limited tummy time, container baby syndrome, illness?
Sure. So this is one that I think probably deserves like its whole episode on its own. But basically, what we're looking at is the time period when these reflexes should be present. So conception through the first year, any complications and things that disrupt development during that time. So like I kind of briefly mentioned, birth complications are actually the number one risk factor. And I think that like when they were actually studying these things and trying to determine that, I don't think anybody expected that to be the case. So the school that I went to, they were researching, trying to develop a screening questionnaire to see like, can we ask about a child's history and look at these different factors and accurately predict whether or not they're going to have these issues with reflexes and these other delays. And while they were doing that, they just evaluated a lot of different pieces, and birth complications ended up being the number one risk factor. After that, it was going to be complications during pregnancy. So things like stress, illness, drug toxin exposure, those types of things. And then the second was complications in infancy, particularly skipping motor stages like crawling. That's a big risk factor for not being able to work through these types of reflexes. So a lot of things that happen during those stages. And then, of course, anything really traumatic that happens while kids still have that Moro reflex is going to be a big risk factor too. So one of the ways that our brain can respond to something traumatic is by holding on to that kind of more sensitive, hyperactive stress response. That's just protective. Basically, it's like something traumatic happens and the body is saying like, no, we need this to keep us safe. And you don't kind of develop a more mature response. Those kind of mature, developed responses come out of a sense of being safe. Like we have to have this safety first before we can get into like a grow and develop and thrive mode. So that's looking at any sort of traumatic event during that stage is a risk factor.
Wow. Awesome. So if a parent is listening and thinking, wait, this sounds like my 7-year-old, or this sounds like me as an adult, is it ever too late to integrate a reflex?
It's not actually. So adults are trickier. I have a lot of colleagues that work with adults. I prefer to work with kids. But really, I work with kids from 3 until young adulthood. So I'll work with kids that are like in their 20s if they're home, just because the type of therapy that we do to treat these things, you need a parent or somebody to help you with a lot of times. But I see success with, my late teens, just like I do with earlier younger kids. It comes with some like different things that we have to consider. But for the most part, our brains are really adaptive and resilient. And if you can like get things moving and get them working right, you can make really incredible changes to the way these reflexes work, to our stress response. It's all very adaptive.
Awesome. What's the very first step a parent should take if they suspect a retained reflex, and what kind of professional should they be looking for?
So it's tricky because there's not a ton of people that specialize in reflex work in the US. There's a couple of different organizations that teach reflex work. My favorite is the one that I did. I'm obviously a little biased, but I went to a school called the Institute of Neurophysiological Psychology. They're the only one that have like a postgraduate program for this, and it's really in depth. And so you're required to have an undergraduate to get in. You're required to have like extended professional work experience. And then you're required to do continuing education and to participate regularly in meetings with them. So it really is just like a much more robust way of looking for things. So my first suggestion would be to hop on INPP's website and see if there's somebody close to you. There's a few of us, like me, I will do remote visits for families if they don't have somebody that's close by, because there's not a ton of us in the US that do it. And so we've had to kind of adapt to be able to serve families that don't have somebody that's close by. So go there. You can also reach out to me. I'm happy to connect you with people if there's somebody close to you. And if not, I'm happy to work with families remotely.
Fantastic. If parents take just one thing away from this conversation, what do you want them to walk away with knowing about primitive reflexes?
So I think the biggest thing to take away is if you have a child that's struggling with something, I really like to look at things developmentally. So things like emotion regulation, things like attention, reading, writing, learning, all of these are skills that should develop. They're things that we should learn. They're not things that we come knowing how to do. And so when a kid is struggling with something like that, I think it's important to look at things developmentally, look at all of the things that go into building a healthy brain, a healthy body, and all of these different skills, so that we can have a better idea of how to support kids and what these different areas are that might be weak.
Awesome. How can parents get a hold of you?
Probably the best way would be my website. It's earlyrootstherapy.com. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, just at Early Roots. But I've got a lot of information on both of those. So if they want to reach out, I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. I don't know where the 50 minutes went by. I mean, that was so fast. It felt like we just started and now it's over. Emily, thank you so much for breaking this down for us. The thing that strikes me every time I have this conversation is just how many of the struggles we chalk up to personality or behavior or just how kids are actually trace back to the tiny piece of wiring that was supposed to switch off in infancy. The good news is that once you know what to look for, you can do something about it, and the earlier, the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into A Parent's Guide to Child Development, where we decode milestones, demystify meltdowns, and occasionally question whether goldfish crackers count as a food group. Spoiler, they do. Make sure to follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an expert tip, breakthrough strategy, or aha moment that can make a big difference in your child's development. It's cheaper than therapy and less messy than glitter slime. We'll be back soon with more expert advice, real talk, and zero judgment. Until then, keep calm and try not to step on any Legos.